Disrupting ain't easy, especially if you're an introvert or sensitive to criticism or plagued sometimes by self-doubt. Today, that changes.
From the edges of publishing, it's Disruptor, celebrating the rebels, mavericks, and weirdos of the publishing industry and encouraging each of you to disrupt in your own way. Now here's your host, John Bard.
Greetings, everybody. I'm John Bard. Welcome to Disruptor, episode 14, with psychotherapist, teacher, and creativity coach, Dr. Eric Maisel. I've been in the publishing world for close to 30 years, and I've seen a lot of things change, but maybe they haven't changed fast enough. And so I asked the question, are there disruptors out there? Are there people and companies that are really changing things in publishing, pushing us into the future, throwing out the old rule book and creating a new one all their own? I went in search of that, and I found them. And on each episode of Disruptor, you'll meet them. Welcome to the journey. It's time to disrupt. Today's episode of Disruptor is brought to you by Writing Blueprints, the breakthrough step-by-step system for writers that creates truly great books. To learn more about the most disruptive way ever to become a successful author, visit writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10% off everything on the site. The writing world has been shaken. Meet the earthquake. Go to writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10%. Writing Blueprints. This is how you write a book. Being a creative, especially a disruptive creative, can be a lonely business. Fear of what others will think, fear of failure, or just your own natural habits can be awfully difficult to overcome. That's why we have a special edition today of Disruptor, featuring a man who is eminently qualified to help you overcome your hurdles. His name is Dr. Eric Maisel. He's the author of more than 40 books and is widely regarded as America's foremost creativity coach. In fact, he trains other creativity coaches nationally and internationally. He's a columnist for Professional Artist magazine, a featured contributor to Psychology Today, and the author of many books, including Rethinking Depression, Mastering Creative Anxiety, Creative Recovery, A Writer's San Francisco, and A Writer's Paris. He joined me from his home in San Francisco. Well, I'm really excited to have Dr. Eric Maisel with us today. He is, as you've just heard, done some remarkable things, and he is here to help you, future disruptors, get everything you need to disrupt. Welcome, Eric. It's great to have you.
Hi, John. Great to be with you.
Yeah. So let's just get right into it. One of the things that we're trying to do here on Disruptor is not just present people who are disrupting the publishing world, but encourage and empower our listeners to do the same. So a lot of our folks, when they see the people we've had on, we've had some really dynamic people who are doing incredible things, and folks like yourself who are just remarkably productive, out there, really making a difference. And a lot of our folks are overwhelmed by that. This is something very different to them. They're creatives, and the idea of sort of being out there and being that active is not natural to them. And so that's why I love having you here, because this is your sweet spot. This is your specialty. So talk a little bit first about, in your experience over these years, what typically holds creatives back from being everything they can be?
Well, there are lots and lots of challenges. I think maybe the biggest one is misunderstanding process and not understanding the extent to which people have to be okay with mistakes and messes and first drafts and things not working. Nobody really wants to enter into the writing of a novel and spend 2 years on something that isn't going to work, but only a percentage of our things will work. How many of Bob Dylan's trillion songs are wonderful? 13, 19, 24. Even for our geniuses, even for our greatest creators, only a percentage of our work is going to work. That's somehow deeply demoralizing to most would-be creators. They don't know that that's what's stopping them, but I think what's stopping them is not realizing that they have to create a body of work in order to get just a few things that are actually excellent.
And that, I think, butts up against another problem that I've seen a lot with creatives, which is they're very sensitive to criticism. So if you're putting out a large body of work into the world, but only a percentage of it is really hitting the mark, you are opening yourself up for some criticism on the stuff that isn't quite there. How do people forge beyond that?
Well, they have to grow a thicker skin. That's number one. They have to let the criticism bounce off. You're embracing, if you're going to be a creative person, you're embracing the idea that criticism is coming. Shouldn't surprise you, and hopefully it shouldn't hurt you. Much of it won't get under your skin. If you let too much of it get under your skin, then your skin really is too thin. But I think the main thing is to remember that your writing isn't just about words. It's one of your life purpose choices. It's one of the ways you make meaning. And if you're going to let some stranger in far away wherever say something that prevents you from living your life purposes and making meaning, that's really on you. That's you not living your life purposes. And that's you giving into small dramas and little bits of histrionics when it's completely unnecessary.
So purpose is the ultimate shield, do you think, for letting criticism bounce off you?
Purposes, I want to make the distinction because I don't believe there is a purpose to life. I think there are our life purpose choices. There are life purposes. Writing may be only, creativity may be only one of our life purposes or life purpose choices. Others might be activism or relationships or service or what have you. We have an array of life purposes. But if one of them is our creating, is our writing, then yes, by remembering that it is one of our life purposes, that does help inoculate us to criticism. Let me just say, I've tried to train our kids to understand this. And so our younger daughter had a book come out a couple of years ago, and she called me up and she said, "Dad, I have haters." She was excited to have haters, meaning that her work was out there and people were responding to it, and some were liking it and some weren't. So I'd gotten the lesson across to them that you're going to have haters, and that's got to be okay. And just to say it yet one different way, we know it's a cliche to say that everyone has an opinion, but really, everyone has an opinion. And there's no particular reason to take in anyone's opinion if it doesn't match your own. There was a book written some years ago, not really written, compiled by someone who put together all of the reviews of E.M. Forster's A Passage to India and set up the reviews in such a way that it was most boring book ever written, most exciting book ever written, best book ever written, worst book ever written. You could get a very clear picture of everybody having a different opinion about that book by glancing through a book like that. Everybody will have an opinion. And just to finalize that point, some of the things that we think are the greatest masterpieces ever done were hated when they appeared. One that comes to mind is the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, which is now the standard of the repertoire, but which was booed off the stage when it was first played. So that's all a long-winded way of saying we can't let criticism get to us.
How, if external opinion is not the driving force for a creator, what should be? What's a healthy driving force to keep somebody motivated and productive and creative?
There are lots of different ways to think about it. I would say speaking to one person. And I'm pausing there because there's an old-fashioned idea coined by the avant-garde artists of the turn of the last century that they were looking for an audience of one, that they only expected that the occasional person would understand what they were doing or respond to what they're doing. So just as you wouldn't not to take care of your child because you only have one child, you wouldn't think that one child was too few to care about. So I think we should consider one reader important and just be speaking to somebody. If we get a response from someone, that's a kind of blessing. We have, bestsellerdom and stardom and all of those ideas kind of emblazoned in our brains in such a way that it's hard to remember that just having somebody respond, what Virginia Woolf called an echo, just having some kind of echo is valuable.
Is that, have you seen an area or a person that maybe you've worked with that very limited but direct confirmation of what they're doing is enough sustenance to keep them moving forward. I think most people think, well, I'm doing so much work for only one person to get this. But you're absolutely right about that. How do you kind of balance that out in somebody's mind?
Well, you balance it out by using that body of work metaphor. That is, if this particular work has only reached 1 or 9 or 14 people, so be it. But your meaning needs haven't ended when you publish that. Your life purpose needs haven't ended when you publish that. You have the next thing to turn to, and maybe it'll draw a larger audience. Maybe it won't, but maybe it will. So if rather than being too invested or over-invested in the thing in front of you, you can remember that you're aiming for a body of work, some of which will reach an audience, some of which won't. I think that's the healthy way to look at a writing career.
You've talked about purpose, finding purpose for each part of your life, but in this case, for your creative self. Other folks who have been on Disruptor have talked about defining success on your own terms. Are we talking about the same thing here, or is your purpose and how you define success, are they two different things?
We need to think thoughts that serve us. That is a headline idea. So that means that we do need to define success in ways that serve us. And if defining success in a minimalist way or in a modest way is what serves us, that's fine. There's no reason why that can't sit side by side with attachment and ambition and desire and appetite and all those kind of hungry words. There's no reason why they can't sit side by side. We can have a modest aspirations for this thing we just put out and still have big ambitions for our overall career. So that's the way I would say that we need real world successes. We do need to define and frame success for ourselves. If, however, we don't accumulate some successes that actually feel successful, that is, if it becomes too much of a game of narrowly defining success in such a way that we're trying to keep our meaning afloat, that won't work over time. That sort of cognitive or linguistic tactic won't really work over time. We need some bigger successes than that over time in order to sustain ourselves.
So that brings us back to purpose. Your book, Life Purpose Bootcamp, an excellent book that had significant impact on me when I read it. I found it very powerful because it allowed you to define, much like defining success on your own terms, it allowed you to define purpose on your own terms. It's very easy, I think, to look around at other people who are maybe doing a million things in the world, who are running for office, who are or headlining, executive director of organization, doing this and that, thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not doing anything. But what you're doing in that book and in your teaching is really allowing people to define purpose for themselves. Talk a little bit about how somebody can start moving in the direction of thinking in terms of their own personal purpose.
Well, I think the simple translation of the word purpose, the way we're using it, is what's important to you. Now, if nothing is important to you, that's an existential crisis.
Right.
That's a big deal problem if nothing is important to you. And you may have to talk yourself into the belief that something is important if nothing feels actually important. But for most people, there are things that are important to them, and they may be, so to speak, small things like holding your child's hand as you cross the street. That may be what's important. Or they may be huge, ambitious things, winning the Nobel Prize or what have you. But there are many things that are important to a person. I advise clients and readers to create a list of what's important. Those become your life purpose possibilities or life purpose choices. That's kind of step one. Step two is to see if there's a thread or theme or way to express all of those various purposes in a simple statement. For me, it's do the next right thing. For me, that captures a lot of what my life purposes are. Of course, that has idiosyncratic meaning to me, but that's my life purpose statement, do the next right thing. And then, and this is a big deal idea, you have to get your life purposes on your daily to-do list, which is much harder than it sounds, because most people are pulled by their errands, duties, responsibilities, day jobs, worries, a million things. And they don't, A, have their list of life purposes, but B, don't get any of them onto their daily to-do list. It's why I suggest a kind of 1 minute or half-minute life purpose check-in where you start the day and where you announce to yourself which of your life purposes you're actually going to try to get to today. Writing may not be one of them on that day. It might be a relationship thing. It might be having a hard conversation with your son about his drinking. It might be anything under the sun that you deem important. But to have announced it gives you a better chance of actually getting to it on that day.
Let's talk a little about things that are going on in the rest of your life. So let's talk about distraction. And not just personal distraction, but the world itself. We live in an unusual time, and we are filled with distractions and things that not just distract us, but perhaps generate real emotional reactions in us. How do you protect your own life purpose and your own creative process from the bombardment of what happens outside of our homes and our lives?
Ignore it unless you mean to take action. If you're just taking in the dramas of the world, if you're just catching up on what's going on, that's bad for you. Mm-hmm. If you mean to take action, then take action. If activism is one of your life purpose choices, be an activist. But if you're not doing anything in the moment that's active, absolutely and assiduously ignore what's going on. There's no good reason to know what's going on unless you mean to take action.
Right. Is that a fair comment for everything, for every part of your life, that you have your defined purposes, you have the people you care about, you have the things that are important to you, the other drama that happens, whether it's in your town, in your extended family, at your workplace, whatever, you need to push that aside so you can stay on your path?
Absolutely. You have to get out of your own way, and one way to get out of your own way is not to be noticing this, that, or the other thing. I had the opportunity to talk about distraction when I was speaking to some writers group at one of those luncheons where you speak and folks are eating at the same time. And so I was speaking and hooked up to an amplifier with a long cord, and the waiters kept unplugging me accidentally as they walked by. So my voice would sound like this, and then it would sound like this, and then it would sound like this. And of course, the room went crazy with anxiety. They were distracted by this event. And it gave me the opportunity to tell them, if I'm not distracted, if I can keep speaking, you shouldn't be distracted. Why are you being distracted by this? We're so tempted to buy into the dramas around us. I notice that when I do 5-day deep writing workshops, and in the first break on the first day, everybody's still gossiping and inclined to be in their own way and be chatting about nothing in particular. By the third break on the first day, they're taking breaks in a more solitary fashion and still thinking about the book they're working on, rather than wondering what the weather is in Dublin at that split second. So we can train ourselves to be more aligned with our own work, be closer to our own work, stay in touch with our own work. Every time we let our neurons disconnect for the sake of some little thought, it's that much harder to get back to the writing work. You don't want your brain, you don't want your neurons to be disconnecting what in Buddhism would be called, monkey mind, or what's really just thoughts, all thoughts, because all thoughts grab neurons. Every single thought, positive, negative, what have you, is the grabbing of neurons. And so every time you have any small thought, the garden needs weeding, or whatever the thought is, you've helped prevent yourself from getting your writing done.
Talking about the monkey mind, are you an advocate for meditation for creative people?
Not particularly, because it's one of those things that regularly takes place at the beginning of the day, along with one's yoga and Tai Chi and journaling and everything else that people do. And that's the best time to be writing. Mm-hmm. So the caveat would be, if you have a meditation practice, don't have it be the first thing you do, because you want to be getting to your writing first thing. There are 3 important reasons for that. One is, of course, if you get to your writing first thing, you'll get a lot of writing done. That's the obvious one. The second, though, is that you'll get to make use of your sleep thinking. Your brain's been thinking all night. It's been dreaming, but it's also been thinking. And you can have the experience of taking dictation, of getting right to your writing and taking dictation, if you turn to your writing first thing. If you turn to meditation, you make no use of your sleep thinking. In fact, you fight against your sleep thinking. And the third reason is that you'll have the experience of having made some meaning on that day, and the rest of the day can be half meaningless and you won't get depressed. It's kind of a meaning reservoir to get to your work first thing.
Right.
But the real reason has to be, first thing to me, is the sleep thinking bit, which is very important. Folks don't understand the extent to which we think while we sleep and how much use we can make of that ability.
Yeah. I've been reading some interesting things about that, of people using the idea of sleep as a problem solver, as really laying out the things that you're concerned about, things you're trying to work through, whether it be a plot point or whether it be something in your life,
Absolutely.
and letting sleep almost help you find the answers. Is that
Not
it's
almost,
that?
not almost, actually,
Yeah.
actually help you.
Yeah. So that's
And the reason is that we get our whole brain back when we sleep. We're not thinking about weeding the garden and what have you. So actually, we have a better brain while we're sleeping than while we're awake. That's why we can do such good work on our novel, or such good work at problem solving in life, is that we have more of our brain available while we sleep than while we're awake.
Do you approach that in any formalized way before you go to sleep? Do you think about what you're trying to
I
answer?
don't anymore, but I practice. I have a book on this called The Magic of Sleep Thinking. So I know this well. And that book has a multi-step plan in it. I don't know, 29 and a half steps or something. But there really are only two steps. And one is going to bed with what I call a sleep thinking prompt, kind of a wonder rather than a worry. Most people are going to bed worrying about something.
Mhm.
This change would be to wonder what Mary wants to say to John in chapter 3, that kind of wonder. Go to bed with a sleep thinking prompt and wake up and get right to your work. That's the whole process.
One of your products, one of your courses is called Unleashing the Artist Within. By that, it implies that that there's something deep inside us that is our true artistic self, and then there's something preventing it from being unleashed.
Many
What,
things.
yeah, what are those, what are some of those things, the big ones, that you see again and again as being the things that block us from unleashing that artist within?
Well, one you touched on, and that's fear of criticism, and all kinds of criticism. And another way to say that is self-censorship, especially for memoirists, but for everybody. The whatever you write, the activity of writing is exposing yourself, and many people will pay lip service to the belief that they don't mind exposing themselves, but they actually do.
Sure.
They're actually scared of what their sister will say, or what their pastor will say, or what somebody will say, or just what people will come to understand about them, that they're really more conniving than anybody thought, or meaner than anyone thought, or shadowier than any. So there's that self-censorship piece and fear of exposure and all kinds of cultural constraints. Most people don't understand the extent to which they are scared by their community and their society and their group and their family and what have you. So I would say different faces of censorship probably matter the most with respect to why people don't unleash their natural creative powers. Another reason is the one I mentioned before, and that's misunderstanding process and waiting until they have the thing somehow worked out, waiting to begin when the thing is excellent already, even before one word has been put on the page. Mm-hmm. So that misunderstanding about process and the difference between showing up and attaching to outcomes. We must show up and we must not attach to outcomes. We have to let it be a mess if it's going to be a mess. Right. So between process misunderstandings and self-censorship, those are probably two biggies.
Then, you have something that I think all creatives face, which is this once in a while, is this idea that, well, I'm really not that good. I'm a fraud. And if that notion gets reinforced by negative criticism, is that enough to shut somebody down from ever really trying to be their creative selves?
Sure, of course. We hope it doesn't. We hope they get some good coaching or read a good book that helps them understand that they are not serving their life purpose or meaning needs by stopping. By the way, I don't want to elevate writing to the highest possible thing a person can do. Especially in these times, activism might be just as important or more important than writing. So it's not that if you don't get to your writing, you somehow can't also have other life purposes and other meaning in your life. It's just that for most of us, and I think it's a very simple thing, we fell in love with reading when we were 5 or 6 or 7. Fell in love with stories, whatever it was, whether it was Alice in Wonderland or Animal Farm, or whatever kind of writing it was, we fell in love way back then. And that has had meaning for us our whole lifetime. And we deeply want to do it for ourselves. So to not do it is a huge disappointment. And it's very hard for that not to be a huge disappointment. So even if you've sold yourself on the idea that you're not going to write because you can't tolerate criticism or you don't have talent or however you want to say it, there's still going to be that wound. And that wound is only really going to be healed by returning to the writing.
I know you've done quite a bit of work on the connection between depression and creativity. And as someone who's dealt with depression on and off throughout my life, I can tell you that, I look at other people sometimes who've done a bazillion things, and there are days where it's hard to fix breakfast, right? How does somebody, and there are a lot of people with much worse situations than me for sure, how, if you want to get out in the world, but you are buried under this cloud, how do you deal with that?
It's a very complicated question. I'm in the movement that variously calls itself critical psychology, critical psychiatry, and anti-psychiatry. And I do a lot of work in that movement, and I've written many books in that movement. And we take the tack that there is no such thing as depression, in quotation marks, that there is no such thing as a biological mental disorder called depression. There's despair, there's unhappiness, there are all kinds of feeling states, but to buy into the biological model is a mistake, and we could spend, forever talking about that. But given that it's not a biological phenomenon, and I don't believe it is, but rather that it's an existential phenomenon, it's also losing our vision of our life mattering. I think we come to a place where we think that life is a cheat. We've been cheated. That maybe that's another way of saying the thing you just said about other people are doing better. But I think we feel like we've been cheated, and we're upset. We're really maybe enraged, but that rage has turned into sadness, lethargy, all kinds of things that look like the symptoms of depression. So to make this long story short, the answer is to announce that you matter and that your efforts matter. It's returning to self-authorship, self-obligation, self-responsibility, all those old existential ideas about personal responsibility. I think that's the only way back, is to stand up again and do that maybe by dint of force. Grab yourself by the necktie and pull yourself back up. But I think that's what we have to do, because we have to get that energy flowing in us again, that energy of mattering.
Of course, it's very important who we surround ourselves with. So there's two schools of thought on this for people who are going through, let's say, depression or whatever you may wish to call it. Find other people who are experiencing the same thing so you can have a support system. Another school of thought is surround yourself with positive, outgoing people who are being productive. Where do you fall on that? Who should your world be if you are struggling right now?
I think that's another complicated one. There are many kinds of support groups out there, 12-step programs that are very valuable for the folks who find them valuable. So there are all kinds of support systems out there. I think that we, whoever we are, don't like people all that much. And so looking for a certain kind of community is often a fool's errand. Just to tell a quick anecdote, somebody who didn't like people very much, Van Gogh, his first gesture when he got to Provence was to buy 12 huge armchairs for the salon he was going to start, as if he could possibly tolerate 11 other people. There was no chance he was going to pull that off. But that's the kind of conflicting feelings we have of wanting community, wanting a support group, wanting a writing group, wanting this, wanting that, and discovering the first session of our writing group makes us crazy, where somebody criticizes us and we don't ever want to write again. So to repeat, it's a very complicated matter. We have to start with ourselves and our own opinions, and then find our support very carefully.
You are a coach, apart from the many other hats you wear. So let's talk about why a creative person might want a coach and what a coach can do for them.
Well, I think we've named many of the reasons why a person might want a coach. So the twin attributes of a coach are to offer support and accountability. Pretty straightforward. Most creative people do not experience enough support in their life, and they can't really get it from a loved one, or with respect to this, they may get lots of support from a loved one for other things, but often not for their creative efforts. There's often a lot of tension in a household about who's going to earn the money and whether the writing is making any money, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to find support, let's call it locally. So a coach can offer cheerleading support and simple accountability. You know, if I'm working with a client, I want to know what you intend to do this week. And do you mean 5 days a week or 7 days a week? And do you mean 20 minutes or an hour? And do you mean 500 words or 1,000 words? And what do you mean? And what are you going to do? And are you going to check in with me? So the main offerings of a coach are support and accountability. And then there are all kinds of tactics and strategies to help with respect to those two things. A coach should be versed in the kinds of things we've been talking about what process really looks like, and maybe understand, you know, the writing world pretty well, and even have some understanding of whether a poet ever gets a literary agent, or whether self-publishing is a better or worse option than traditional publishing. Knows stuff. A coach ought to know stuff in his or her domain. Know stuff, share stuff, have suggestions, be supportive, and hold clients accountable.
We'll have links to everything below the podcast for everybody in the show notes. And in a minute or two, Eric will be giving the URL where you can find him. But I did have two last questions for you. First, obviously, we have a very diverse group of people listening. They do different things. Their brains are different. The way they interface with the world is different. So it's impossible to kind of pick any sort of one-size-fits-all thing. But from your experience, from your years of working with creatives, if you want to have one takeaway for somebody who's listening today, who feels a little bit lost, who feels a little bit unsure, what is the first place to start?
It's going to be super simple and maybe sound oversimple. Write every day. Yeah. Because of that is, when you miss 2 days of writing or 3 days of writing, you typically lose 6 months or 4 years. It's that when people stop writing, they stop writing for a long time. No one cares if you lose a day here or there. You might be living one of your other life purposes, so there may be a good reason to not write today or tomorrow. But it's losing some consecutive days that's profoundly painful and ultimately disabling, because you typically don't get back to your writing for a long time. So as I say, it sounds oversimple, but my headline would be, write every single day.
Who is your favorite disruptor in history, living or dead?
Well, it would be someone that most of your listeners probably have not heard of, but it's a fellow named Thomas Szasz, who is a Hungarian psychiatrist. And for the last 75 years, he died recently, so he's not doing it anymore. But for the very long time, he was the one pointing out what he called the myth of mental illness. He was single-handedly fighting psychiatry for between 50 and 60 years. And we believe that when he died, psychiatrists had a big party. That's a joke, but not so much of a joke, because he was a thorn in their side. And so he's in my lineage, and he's my favorite disruptor.
That's great. There's so much. This could have went on for a very long time. So instead, I will just simply allow you to tell folks where they can learn more, because you have so many topics of interest to creatives that we have not even had the opportunity to touch upon today. So let the folks know how the best way there is to get a hold of you and to learn more about what you do.
Sure. Come to my site, which is ericmaisel.com, and that's EricMaisel.com. And I have a couple of 5-day deep writing workshops coming up. One in August is in Mendocino, California, and one in October is in Vancouver, British Columbia.
Real quickly, tell us about those deep writing workshops.
Well, people love them. We don't share or critique the work. I think it's a little nutty to write something on the spot and then have it critiqued as if it's your best work. But so there's no sharing and no critiquing. A lot of writing gets done. I present what I think are important lessons, and then folks work on their cherished products. It's a lot of wonderful energy in writers writing alone together. And I think the headline is, people really love those workshops.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I know we've certainly set a spark in a lot of people's minds today, And hopefully they'll take it from there and become more creative and productive and happier than ever. And I want to thank you for joining us on Disruptor.
Thanks for having me.
Today's episode of Disruptor was brought to you by Writing Blueprints, the breakthrough step-by-step system for writers that creates truly great books. To learn more about the most disruptive way ever to become a successful author, visit writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10% off everything on the site. The writing world has been shaken. Meet the earthquake. Go to writingblueprints.com and use the code DISRUPT to save 10%. Writing Blueprints. This is how you write a book.
For show notes and videos, go to disruptcast.online. And to start a disruption of your own, visit writingblueprints.com to discover the most innovative and coolest way ever to write a great book. We'll be back next week. Until then, go forth and disrupt.